translation of an A and B story into the circle. Like, so how does a basic A and B story go into this circle? So you start with what is the problem? What is the solution? But at the same time, and I'm just going to lay this out for you, and then we'll go back through it. So what's the problem? What's the solution? What's the problematic world and the problematic way of that world? What's the unproblematic way of the other world? So then you have the problem, you have the solution, and then you have what's the world like with the solution applied, with the world fixed. So this will just help you situate your basic concept into the narrative sequence. So what is the problem? So set up the problem at the very beginning. This is going to tell you where the solution goes, and you'll see where that is in the narrative when we get there in a minute. And this will tell you where the world redeemed, the saved world looks like. And if y'all are clear on those things, then you'll start to be able to fill out some of the patterns, some of the narrative sequencing. So let me pause there and give you a second to just at least make sure you have good answers to those questions. What's the thematic problem? What's the world look like in that problem, with that problem? What's the other world look like without that problem? What's the solution to that problem? And what's the world look like saved and redeemed of that problem? So take a few minutes and make sure you're feeling good about that.
Yeah, this definitely does help in terms of like setting up the narrative structure to make sure that you have all the boxes ticked. Thank you for this.
Yeah, this slide has probably been a long time coming.
Well, there's some things it's like, I think I have this, it's like, oh, okay, I need to fill in like this and this. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. And if anybody has any questions, anybody else can mute while they ask, feel free.
And I remember this was asked, I think like 3 classes ago, and I can't remember what the answer was, but was it like when we presented, are we just talking about our idea, or are you wanting more?
You'll have your choice. You can deliver your story however you want to.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm expecting telepathy from at least one person.
So, the other world?
Yeah.
The other world that you're referring to, is this like after the hero's journey's already done and like the hero is reborn into like the new world, or is this like the I don't know how to say it, but if there's like
this is the world they travel through on the journey.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying to ask.
We're going to start at home. We're going to go into the other world, which is going to like blow our minds because it's going to be nothing like home and doesn't have all the problems of home. And then we're going to come back with those lessons to home. All these fancy narrative structures, and I think this might be the like most simple, stripped down mechanical way to think about the most basic dimension of the story. So as you guys do that, I want to start to point to how some of these other pieces function together. So after you know, you've identified, you've got the problem here, right? But this is where your character now recognizes the problem, right? Remember, this is the increase of awareness or the inciting incident. But what that really is that's when they're recognizing the problem. And it's the recognition of the problem that is exactly what calls them to respond. Now, their recognition of the problem might not be like direct. It might be kind of like removed or conceptual or, you know, the beginning of their recognition. But it's exactly the recognition of the problem that's going to kind of pull them, the question that drives the quest. And so, and this, yeah, these, you'll just see these like kind of I'm gonna actually, maybe what I'll do is, here's how my brain works. My brain has all of these circles stacked on top of each other, and I go back and forth between all of them, at will or whatever. And so, like, this is really like a really good grounding place to come. And I hope what you'll do is look at it like next to this one, And I'm giving you the slides so that you can go back and forth and you can see the connections, right? So, like, you can see the catalyst, the call to adventure, the shadow disruption. You can see all those in relationship to the recognizing the problem and the calling to the solution. So for you, I think, like, I don't know how to. I hope in this class we've like gone deep enough into it that you're starting to like begin to have that like layers of the circle that you can go back and forth on a little bit. But that's kind of what I'm hoping, how I'm hoping this is going to work. So the other thing that I think is really important to get, and this will help us set us up for Act 2, is that the climax of Act 2, the ordeal, as it might be called, is set up by the call to adventure or the inciting incident. And this is something I think McKee, maybe it is, makes a really big deal out of it, making sure that your inciting incident is connected with what he's going to call, like, what does he call it? Payoff. He called it, what does he call it? Oh, I've forgotten his phrase. It's down here in these slides. But anyway, the point is that, or what I associate with the ordeal, what Campbell and Vogler call the ordeal. So this helps you structure your whole thing, connecting this with this. So come with me to Alderaan, call to adventure. Let's get Leia. So it's a call to then go do this. The call is kind of inherently like to do the C, like let's save the world. But you don't go, let's save the world. You go, let's do the thing that saves the world, right? So B is like, let's find the solution. And then obviously we're going to try and save the world with the solution, right? So, but the key here is that if you can try and find this connection between your inciting incident and the big ordeal, that will help you a good bit. And the way to kind of think about that structurally is that, well, I don't know. This might not be something you get to put together right as you think about it right now. Like, it might be just something that you remember you need to keep playing with that mechanic. Sometimes the relationship between the inciting incident and the ordeal is something you kind of find. Yeah, Milan.
Can you just remind me real quick which part of this circle the ordeal is?
The ordeal is the bottom, is between the midpoint to the end of Act 2.
So it's the belly of the whale. That's what it is?
Yeah, I think I've shied away from overusing that phrase because it can mean like the whole underworld, or it can mean when you've just immediately been swallowed. But it's in Star Wars, it would be the moment that they're associating with the belly of the whale when they're in the trash compactor. That's like the very bottom of Act 2.
So it's the midpoint, basically?
The midpoint in Star Wars is when they get yanked into the Death Star. So actually, between the midpoint and the end of Act 2 is the Death Star sequence. And I would say the ordeal is the whole Death Star sequence when they're inside the Death Star.
Okay. So it's this 6 o'clock point on the circle, right? B, what is the solution? Is that?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Let's leave it at that for now. What's going to happen right now? We haven't broken Act 2 in half, and since this is the advanced class, I'll go there. Vogler puts the midpoint at the very bottom. I'll show you his slide.
Yeah.
Here we go. Here we go. So he puts the ordeal as the midpoint here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the reward, and then the road back, right? So, and then the resurrection and climax return. So this, however, is the way that, let me show you Save the Cat, which we haven't gone into. Save the Cat makes the midpoint. So, well, okay, let me see. How do I express it? Save the Cat more clearly puts the dark night of the soul, the lowest part of the story, as what happens right before the beginning of Act 3. Like really clearly, the darkest, lowest part of the story is the end of Act 2 that leads into Act 3. And so this is why I think that to correct these so that they're talking to each other, what it really means is which means that the midpoint came before that lowest point. So to fix these to each other, I think that basically there's a reason why one of them's putting the midpoint at the bottom and one of them's putting the ordeal at the bottom, the low point at the bottom. They're both putting different ones geometrically. They're both kind of putting different ones at the bottom. And I personally think that the one that makes the most sense is the Snyder version, and that the midpoint is the middle of Act 2, and that the bottom part is the climax of Act 2, and then Act 3 is the return. So I think that the midpoint comes before the low point, and that's what you would see in Star Wars, where the midpoint is where they're yanked into the Death Star, and then the low point is when they're almost about to die and they're all totally fucked in the trash compactor. And then Act 3 begins when, oh, I've got an idea. Oh, we've got the solution. Oh, let's escape. Oh, let's go solve the problem. So this is a topic that I normally try to avoid talking about, and it's one that I wrestled with a whole lot because it's a place where the paradigms disagree, and I had to really bang my head against it. So let me pause and see how does that make sense for you guys so far? Do you want to talk this one out a little bit?
I think that made it clear for me at least.
I didn't just confuse it extra.
I mean, not too much, I don't think, because I've always kind of associated the midpoint with being that bottom point. But I can see how it can be. It is different, like how you said. I think, like you said, well, wait, what was the midpoint of Star Wars again?
The actual temporal timeline, in the timeline, the midpoint is when they show up at the Death Star, or show up thinking that they're going to get Leia, and the planet's destroyed, and instead they get yanked into the Death Star.
Okay,
so that
right.
starts. That's the midpoint, and we're going to talk about midpoints today anyway. So let's. That's one of the key pieces. And then the end of Act 2 is when basically they all start working together again. They start escaping and leave the Death Star, and then the Act 3 is then once they're free and attacking and stuff. I personally think that the midpoint is way too early for the low time of the story. I think it's way more sculpted to have the low point be the end of Act 2. But here's the other way. Let's talk about this a little bit because it's where we're going to go. But so I think that the other thing, when I go into it, I think the midpoint is basically where what you thought you were going to do isn't what you're going to do. It all of a sudden, like, your plan is not going to happen. So another example in Neverending Story, he's supposed to be going to this turtle person who's going to tell him how to save the world. But he gets to the turtle, and the turtle's like, nope, you got to go to the other side of the world. And he keeps falling down the turtle shell, like the myth of Sisyphus. That's kind of the myth of Sisyphus, is kind of like the midpoint. The thing where you were pushing the stone to the top of the hill, and what you thought was it is not it. But here's the thing about that at a deeper level, at an individuation level. This is when your will starts to fail. This is when the willfulness is no longer solving the problem, and the conscious mind is no longer solving the problem. And you have to, because ultimately the challenge of this lower part of the journey, the challenge of the lower registers to go through the lowest part here, what you've got to do to get through that part is let go. Will is not the way through. Ego and consciousness is not the way through. So the midpoint I think of is when the ego's plan breaks down, when the will's, strength of will no longer serves. And now this is when, so like in the Matrix at the midpoint is when he gets to the Oracle and she says, "You're not the one." Well, the whole time we've been leading up to this. This is the plan. Go to the Oracle, find out you're the one. We get to the Oracle, you're not the one. So his ego is broken. By will, we also mean control and planning. So the plan is broken. And what happens right after this? Everything goes to shit. So I think that what you have here, but everything's going to shit. So now we're talking about that time in the lunar cycle when we're waning from the small moon all the way to nothing. This is the final waning of the light. This is the winter when we're getting the darkest of dark. So I think the midpoint is what kicks us off in that deconstructive phase where the will fails, ego's plan fails, the plan fails. Now we got to deal with everything going to shit. The ego's got to learn how to die. This is where we have to actually, the strength of the former self is going to fail us, and the true new skills are going to be what we have to use, which are intuitive, which are these opposite skills than what we came in using. So that's some heavy stuff, but that's where I'm at with it, what I think is actually going on. Are y'all following me here so far? Sweet. Yeah. So when the Buddha achieves enlightenment is actually, does anybody know what enlightenment translates as? Does anybody remember? I've probably said it a few times, maybe not in this class. I want this one to stick with you. I want you to remember what enlightenment means because it's going to help you with this whole story structure. Extinguishing. Oh, I'm sorry. I did that to you. Enlightenment means to enlighten. Nirvana means to extinguish.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. Nirvana means extinguish. And then enlightenment.
Yeah, you talked about that. Yeah, you mentioned that.
So what we're doing here is we're going from that. So like I think of the midpoint is where the Buddha learned the middle way. Midpoint. And what he learned at the middle way was my original plan to be super willful isn't going to work. I was going to be like, not going to eat, not going to have sex, super strong will, super strong like strength, ascetic willfulness. And then at the midpoint, at the middle way is when he realizes, wait a minute, that's not the way to do it. And he breaks with that ascetic intensity. And now he's going to move towards nirvana, which is to actually extinguish. So we go from the midpoint when that kind of willfulness breaks and he decides, okay, I can drink some milk and eat some rice and interact with this young woman. And then he will move towards nirvana, which will extinguish that will, that ego, that atman fully. And only after it's fully extinguished does he finally have the insights that are the insights at the foundation of enlightenment. And I never miss a chance to say what those are. Does anybody remember what the three sides, the three gems, the three sides of enlightenment are? Yeah, Maddie.
I was just thinking, okay, can you elaborate on that question, please?
Mm-hmm. The three key insights of enlightenment for the Buddha.
I don't know.
So the first one is sunyata, the second one is anatman or anatta, and the third one is paticca samuppada. And what those mean is that sunyata means emptiness. So you go from from nirvana, which is the extinguishing. That's the state of bliss. That's the state of enlightenment. Is nirvana. The experience of enlightenment is emptiness, extinguished, blissful, no light. And only because it's so fucking dark. This is like for the Sufis, this is the same moment that you've so perfectly cleaned your heart that the universe reflects off of it perfectly. God reflects off of it perfectly from their paradigm. Same thing with, so for enlightenment, for the Buddha, one of the metaphors is to have no dust in your eye. You see how having no dust in your eye is like the same as having a clean mirror? There's no obstruction. So this is to be empty of obstruction. To be extinguished is also to be empty. It's the extinguished of that will, of that ego, of that atman, so that you can now have no obstructions. And so you're now in this state of nirvana, and you see the truth of sunyata. And sunyata is that everything is empty. This is not just a thing of stuff. It is a bunch of interdependent actions. There's no thing. There's only interdependent actions. And I experience it as a thing. A flower is not a flower. A flower is a convergence of water and air and seed and all these things. So everything is dependent. So it is empty. So it is empty. So the way that the three gems are all connected. So everything is empty. And the way to explain how everything is empty, yet we see what we see, is paticca samuppada. Everything is dependently co-arising. So there is no inherent value in anything, the opposite of an atomistic worldview. No inherent value. Everything is dependently co-arising, interacting. Everything is empty, interacting. So now the third piece of this is anatman, emptiness of self. So your ego is only a construct. Your ego has dependently co-arisen. There is no fundamental eternal ego in there. No atman, anatman, the no self. So this insight that we are empty, that everything is empty and everything is dependently co-arising, those are the three insights. And these are the insights of enlightenment. So the light, the first light, comes from the wisdom of the complete darkness, of the complete emptiness. So these are the key plot points that we want to talk about today. We'll go back through them in sequence. So you notice here, okay, let me go actually.
Good question. Hold on. What was the second one? It was something has no value. What was that one?
Sunyata is emptiness.
Yeah. Everything is dependent, co-arising, and then what was the next part of that? It was something about
and that you as an individual
have no value.
No, not that you have no value, but that you have no inherent value.
No inherent. That was the word. Thank you.
Yeah, it is all dependently co-arising. So now look at this moment here. So let's look at Save the Cat for a second. This is that gray one on the outside. Well, the moment where the Buddha is realizing his emptiness, this is the dark night of the soul for Save the Cat. This is the emptiness of the new moon, or the emptiness of the eclipse. Oops. The minimum part of death, the very bottom of death, the very transition from death to life, right? So this is when death, the corpse is deader and deader and deader, and now there's a new spark that brings Osiris's corpse back to life. That's that transition from the maximum emptiness to this new spark. So we can translate these across. Same thing with renewing the planet, that first spark. So this is where the enlightenment takes place, down here, where we have and you would associate the enlightenment with the grail, or the insight, the solution. But let me show you this real quick. So let's say you have the problem is suffering, that all life is suffering. The solution is that everything is impermanent and that everything is empty. The enlightenment, the three pieces we just went through. So he recognizes the problem that all life is suffering, which calls him on a journey towards figuring out the solution. So he goes on the journey and he has to learn to let go of the old way of seeing things, which is more willful. And he has to learn the new way of seeing things, which is more empty, to get to the solution. Once he has the solution, now he's going to deliver this solution to the world. He's going to now give his sermon and create, and actually he like averts a war and everything in his hometown. He like goes back to his hometown and stops a war and like brings peace and everything. Okay. Yeah, Maddie.
I was just gonna ask, like, the bottom of the circle that you're talking about, like midnight, that's where the ego dies as well, right? That's where the ego happens. Okay.
Okay, so now we see where that's the ego happens. How does that relate to anatman?
Oh, it's like when your ego dies, it's like, I take it very literally sometimes, like having that ego death is like, okay, I'm no special than anybody else. But like, then again, we're all special at the same time, right? Like,
so that's exactly it. So it's the insight. The ego death is actually an insight concerning egolessness. Like, oh, it's not that important. The ego is not the main thing here. Anatman. That's not the story. The dependent co-arising, the dependent relationship of myself with everything else, that's what matters. So you see how the ego death in, let's say, the story of Theseus, this is where he decapitates the Minotaur, representing his ego death, the killing of that bull, that bull willfulness, right? That's the same as the extinguishing, nirvana. And that they're both this ego death. Now, by the way, this is also the key insight for Odysseus. When Odysseus has to escape from Polyphemus, the ogre, or the Cyclops, he has to tell Polyphemus that he is nobody. He says, I am nobody. And then Polyphemus goes, hey, nobody poked out my eye. Nobody poked out my eye. And then all the people think he's crazy, right? But it's the same. You notice we're escaping from the underworld. The cave of Polyphemus is the underworld in this story, in that story. And his way out is to stab out the eye. There's our ego death. And to have the solution of no self. To then say, I'm nobody. And that's how he gets out. And he leaves with the sunrise, holding when the stone being rolled away is symbolic. It's the same thing as Jesus leaving the tomb, leaving the cave. When the stone is rolled away, he leaves the cave. It symbolizes his resurrection. And he's gripping onto a ram. He escapes by holding a ram, and the ram leaves the cave. And that's the sunrise. The ram represents the sunrise, like Ra. Also, like, by the way, our Golden Rams at the Sunset Los Angeles football team. The Rams of the Sunset. So, okay. We've kind of like danced all over the Act 2 plot points. Oops. Let me just go through right here, just kind of Act 2 in general. And this might be a useful slide. It's in that document. I think it's the last one in your document. I moved it. This just goes through the 3-act structures of the various people we've looked at, most of them at least, the ones that had 3-act structures. So that might help you orient too. So, you know, if you start to do this, you start to see how much of your story just comes out, right? Just defining the problem, establishing the normal world, the other world. Now we've got to leave. Now we've got to initiate into this world. We've got to depart from the problem, learn this problem. It kind of gives us a lot of texture. So by the time you've established the 2 worlds and then these 3 acts, you've got a lot going on. So for Campbell, your character at this whole time in Act 1 is separating. And the whole time in Act 2, separating from the other way. And the whole time in Act 2 is initiating. And the whole time in Act 3, returning. So initiating into the new way of seeing, and then returning with your new self, your new way of seeing, to the world. So just keep thinking about your story, and I'm gonna keep going through all these real quick. For Genep, it's this, he gets this pattern from Genep, so I want to give Genep, which I apparently can't spell, credit. He says preliminary rites are what he calls it. These are the things you do to get ready to go. Psyching yourself up. And the preliminary rites may include expressing your fears. Then the liminal rites. These are, liminality is what is his word for the world between. So dream would be a liminal world between waking and day, night and falling asleep and waking up. The liminal space of being in a dream, or the liminal might be a boundary between being awake and being asleep. Whatever it is, liminal represents at the limit. When you're so much in the middle of the limit that you're not on one side or the other. So I just got, you guys know Rebecca McKendry? She just asked me some questions about Prometheus and about his sacrifice. And one of the things she wanted to know about, well, she wanted to know about like what's the deal with the liver. And one of the things is that Prometheus is at the sunrise between the world below and the world above. And that the old priests used to think that somebody living in between, somebody who's dying, is existing on the world of the living and the world of the dead at the same time. And so because they exist on both sides, they can get prophecies from both sides. And so Prometheus, who's there between day and night, has this organ, this liver. And what they used to do is called hepatoscopy, where they would study the liver of something that was, as it was dying, for like weird spots that were supposed to tell them about the future. Spots on the liver of a dying animal to predict the future. Anyway, that's what liminal means. So liminal means you're now in this world, in this liminal space where crazy stuff happens. Think of it as the other world. And then the post-liminal rites. So again, return. Okay, so Vogler, same thing, separation. But for him, instead of just initiation, he calls it descent and then return. So basically the same thing there. Sid Field, now we're getting into some screenwriting terminology, so this will be useful for some of you here. I think it's a little bit more structured. For Field, it's the setup. Act 1 is setting everything up. And that helps us remember that like A is just a setup for B, right? So all the arcs, everything you want to have happen, you're setting up the opposite first so it can happen. So you're pulling back the slingshot here, setup. Confrontation. This is a favorite conversation in a lot of screenwriting classes. Conflict and confrontation. Conflict and confrontation. Conflict, conflict, conflict. Especially if you've ever had a V. Rubenstein. Conflict and confrontation. So then from confrontation into resolution. So setting up your world, setting up your characters. These are all the introductions to everything. Now let's have confrontations between everybody. And then finally, we're going to want to resolve these problems. Of course, they all have more beats, or most of them do. These are just these 3 acts. And then we've also talked about Nietzsche, beast of burden in the beginning, the tyrant, the thou shalt reality. The middle is where we initiate into becoming that lion. And then the end is where we're going to become the child and see a new day and deliver a new world, a new vision. Did going through it as 3 steps in those different 3 versions, and going through the 3 steps next to the A and B story, next to the normal and other world, is that starting to give some of you guys some structure? Okay, I'm gonna do because I want to transition into the individual beats, and because this is probably a lot to take in and maybe helping some of you. Let me go get a cup of water, and y'all can round out your thoughts real quick. Okay, cool. Let me now take us to A and also to oops. There we go. So back over to this document. So this is what we're going to go through now at this point is just these beats. So I want to call your attention to those. So, but while we look at those, so I'm going to put, maybe what I'll do is I'll put this, oops, right there. And then I'll put maybe like this one. Let's try this one. No, let's do this one. Where is it? Okay, cool. There we go. There we go. Okay. So, all right. So we're in Act 2. In the last part of the class, in the last class session, we left ourselves off with the crossing of the threshold. This is that place where you're now going into the other world, down the rabbit hole, through the wardrobe, into the out of the matrix, into Oz, whatever it is. And I always want to make the point to always try and make this exciting. People love these scenes. These are some people's favorite scenes. When I show stuff in class, I know it is. I know crossing the threshold is much more fun. People love these, tornado moments. This is the moment that carries us to another place. Don't rush it. Enjoy the transition. I think it's boring when you just go through a gate. There was a movie that did that. It was Dark Tower, and literally it was just like through a gate. And I really like, but what they had a whole sequence that happened at the gate to try and make it interesting. But that whole transition is fun. Don't rush it. Show us the transition of weirdness. But anyway, this is the sun setting. This is the transitioning into fall, from spring, from summer towards fall and into winter. This is going to sleep, transitioning into dream. This is transitioning into death. So that's the threshold crossing. So this is the time when your character is kind of setting out into that other world. But now what happens once they're in that world? So now Act 2, they've now decided they're going to fly to this third star to the right and straight on till morning, right? Cut to arriving in the other world. And this is when we're going to normally do a few things in this sequence, and you can sequence them however makes sense to you. And as far as what I'm going to ask you for in this class, you're not going to have to necessarily break down the sequence this well, but define this. An introduction to this world. How are you going to introduce your character to this world? This is when Morpheus is like, let me tell you the deal. This is when they arrive in Neverland, and as we do, the narrator is like, this is a world where such and such. This is when we get to Oz, and they're like, let me tell you about Oz, and the Lollipop Guild sings the song. So introduce the world. This is your opportunity to introduce the world. And don't just introduce the world. Introduce the world in a way where it's really clear we're seeing that it's free of the oppression of the other world. Like, show us that this is different paradigm. Introduce us to the paradigm. And this paradigm should be so overwhelming that the character is likely to experience, Neo throws up right after Morpheus tells him the truth, right? This very normal. This is when you jump right into the deep end and it's cold and you're overwhelmed and you're surprised. So this is so introduce the world, show your character is overwhelmed. The point of showing that your character is overwhelmed is that's going to set us up to experience them learning to not be overwhelmed. They're going to learn how to maneuver in this world. What's the point of showing how awesome it is to maneuver while they're blindfolded if they can all of a sudden show up and they're not even afraid of the dark, right? let's have whatever it is they need to learn. Let's show that they have not learned it yet. This is when in Avatar, Jake shows up to the other world thinking that he's going to try and save himself at night with fire, and it only attracts more trouble. And that will be a good way to show it. Sometimes that's exactly it, is you show the character try the strategy that would have worked for them at home, and it just doesn't work for them. That's a good thing to show. Okay, so that's that kind of belly of the whale moment. I kind of shouldn't even use that phrase anymore because it means so many things. This is what, where is he here? This is what Snyder calls the moment that you experience that bizarro version of the world, is just that kind of overwhelmingly bizarre moment. This is where, for Jung, you start to orient to the dream you're in. Let's see, any of these other ones have good ones to point out. This is when you're first swallowed by the whale. Oh, and in the beginning of an initiation, this is when you're blindfolded. This is the point of the being blindfolded at the beginning of an initiation, is to disorient you. And the value of disorientation is to set up the arc of reorientation. So that's the key reason why you're trying to show your character is disoriented, because you want to set up that arc of their reorientation. Okay, so let me go back. And that's what's going to happen next. And the next part is what a lot of people think of as the whole story. When you're thinking about a story, it's a lot of times it's the whole trailer. This is that part where you're actually going to learn the things that you want somebody to learn. This is not necessarily the big key lesson, but the types of skills. This isn't where Luke learns his big lesson, but this is where he starts learning the Force. And this is, if you think about Star Wars as a trilogy, the second part, the first half of the second part of the trilogy, that's the main training sequence at Dagobah with Yoda. So looking at the trilogy, the original trilogy, looking at the middle movie, looking at the first half of the movie, which is the first half of Act 2, that's the training act of the whole thing. So this is the time when we're going to train. This is when, in the movie Hercules is doing all the gauntlets and all the training stuff and all the tests. This is when, in Iron Man, he's making his super suit. This is when Spider-Man is running around practicing with all of his cool new abilities. This is when, in Shape of Water, they're actually kind of getting to know each other, learning the other. The initiation is fundamentally into the other world, and into the ways that it works. So this is, Luke learning the Force. This is Harry Potter learning magic. This is Neo learning how to manipulate things in the Matrix and training. And for Snyder, he calls this the fun and games moment. This is going to be a high energy. In fact, a lot of times, this is the most montaged part of a story. Because in some ways, okay, in some ways, you're showing how you've learned this, how you've learned that, how you've learned that. But if you think about Batman Begins, this is when he's training with Ra's al Ghul, and he's learning all of the techniques and all the abilities. But it's always a high part. It's always exciting. This is the people fantasize about training. Nobody wants to do work. Everybody fantasizes about the work, about doing work. This was a old, I forget who said this, but this was like a little writing secret. Write about people doing work, because people don't do work. So they love reading about people working hard. But this is that fun part. Yeah, Maddie? Sorry.
I just think that's funny.
Yeah, I know. I'm guilty. So let's look at some other parts of this, other phrases, other terms for this. This is initiation. This is where you're becoming a lion. So this is when you're starting to rebel against that other world. And what you're doing is a rebellion. Everything you're doing is now in rebellion against the other world. Even Alice in Wonderland, what she's doing is at odds with being awake and getting married. This initiation is two-sided. The two sides of the initiation are, on one side, letting go of your old modality. That's what has to wane. And on the other, elevating this new modality, your new skills. And the old modality is likely to be, typically in a human experience, one where you have more control. The old modality is one of consciousness, of willfulness, not always, but if we're talking about the transition from being awake to being asleep, being alive to being in the underworld, being in the visible world to being in the invisible world, in the world of material versus the quantum world, we're talking about a transition from a rational state to something that's beyond rationality. From material truth to a truth that's beyond the material. From visible truth to something that's beyond the visible. You're now in the underworld, in the other world, in the place where you're learning what's beneath the surface. And so for Jung, you're developing your inferior function, the stuff that you've left undeveloped in your unconscious. Don't know where those came from. Now, if we go and look at this remember in the sea journey, this is when you've been swallowed. Now the whale is taking you deeper into the world. So what's that mean? That means that you're not just journeying. Stuff is happening around you that's taking you deeper into the situation, into the world. You're going deeper into the situation as you're training more. And what do we get from Eliada? This is the time that's out with the old, right? Okay, let's go to the midpoint and then come to Eliada. So midpoint. So we go from the belly of the whale to the initiation in the first half of Act 2. So first, I'm overwhelmed. Introduce me to this new world. I don't get it. What's going on? My skills don't serve me. Then train me. Let me learn. Montage, training sequences, building my suit sequences. This is when you've fallen in love. This is the montage of being in love and falling deeper into love, right? Typically, a lot of times, right? After the relationships, you've decided, I'm in. Now the fun part, before any of the bad parts or surprises or twists. So then the midpoint is now going to, and not all, Campbell didn't have a midpoint, for example. The midpoint is very clearly, now we're talking about structure that doesn't come in until we're talking about like screenplays and various narrative structures. So we're bringing it in from Sid Field, from McKee. Chris Vogler now integrates it. And what the midpoint is, and many different, and I hope you'll read more and more about it. It's very interesting. But the midpoint is where, first of all, it breaks Act 2 in half. And that heightened part of the first half of Act 2 think of the first half of Act 2 as rising energy, like exciting, good, positive. But the midpoint's going to turn it so that, oh shit, and it's just going to be getting worse and worse, oh shit, until we get to the end of in the climax of Act 2. So we're kind of like the midpoint is going to turn us downward in our positivity. Because up until then, by the way, we might have even lost track of the plot. We're just training. You know, we got a mentor, we got cool things going on. The plot might be kind of separate. But the midpoint will normally do something to yank a character back into the main plot. So Luke's training, and now all of a sudden we're yanked into the Death Star. We're going to now have to turn our attention from this personal growth period, which feels really good, to, okay, well, not just to the plot, but what I want to now shift to is that now the person, we needed to grow, but now we need to die. Now we shift from growing the stuff that needs to grow to killing the stuff that we need to kill. So Neo goes from building up his skills and doing the training sequence to deconstructing his ego and self-importance in the second half of Act 2. Same thing with the Buddha, right? We go from him developing all these ascetic powers and ascetic skills to the midpoint, and then after the midpoint, we're focusing on the deconstruction of his ego and the deconstruction of the world. The midpoint is often a betrayal. Not always, but there's often a betrayal in the midpoint. Or a near and around the midpoint. So this is where, for example, what's his name? Turned him in the Matrix and betrays them to the agents. This happens right after they go to the Oracle, find out that he's not the one, then the betrayal sequence kicks off. In Star Wars, this is betrayal comes up when it's right in the thick of it, where she's expected to betray the rebels and she doesn't betray the rebels, so they blow up the wrong planet, but she's betrayed. They don't live up to their end of the deal. Anyway, the midpoint is often a place where it feels like you lost, because the thing you thought you were going to do didn't happen. What else to say about the midpoint? A major turn from positivity to negativity, from building up your new skills to deconstructing your old self, transitioning into ego death. There's also this thing, and this is one that I've picked up, and I think Laurel Minter mentioned it to me the first time, and I think it's interesting that the midpoint might be around the time that you see one of the special skills of the main characters, that for the first time you get a glimpse of who they're going to become. They might not win, but you might get a glimpse. So literally what happened with Luke the second before they get caught into the tractor beam is when he finally does the thing real quick blindfolded. In Neverending Story, in the midpoint, it's the place where he learns he's got to go on this whole other mission, but it's also where the reader influences the story for the first time, and that's ultimately how the story is going to be saved, is the reader influencing the story. And we see that for the first time at the midpoint. So, you don't need to sneak that in there, but it's another detail to think about. It might inspire you. It's a good concept. It might be a place where you sneak in that glimpse of who your character is going to become. Okay, so let's now shift from midpoint to the via negativa. Any questions though about the midpoint? Okay. All right, the via negativa, one of my favorite parts here. This is one of the reasons why the via negativa is so important is because ego death is often lip service in a lot of movies. And I find that you don't actually see proper deconstruction of the egoic attitude. You have some symbolic death and resurrection of the character, but they don't actually follow through with that on the psychological dimension of truly humbling the character and truly bringing the character to a place of anatman. And if you do that, and if you have a hero journey where the character doesn't actually deconstruct that heroic ego, then instead the success of the journey only further inflates the heroic ego. You see? And that only serves to inflate the heroic ego of our culture. And the heroic ego of our culture is one of the most damaging situations we have. The inflation, the inflated ego that thinks it's a hero and wants to be a hero. Whereas the real hero has to actually get their hero complex out of the way. That egoic attitude actually has to die and get out of the way so that the hero can truly be in service of something greater than his or herself. And so this is that part of the story where we make sure that happens, where we really make sure that this, and I think this is very important, that you make sure your character does deconstruct that ego. Otherwise, they just, otherwise, the whole journey can just feel like an ego journey. Oh, I want to be a hero. Look, I was the hero. Thank me for being a hero. There's still ego there. So this is the place where the ego should be deconstructed down to the minimum so that the hero really does do this for a heroic reason and will have to sacrifice themselves. Because that's what the ego will never want to do, is sacrifice itself. So I think that typically the via negativa, see what you see here with my Act 2.2 as the whole ordeal, is I think these sequences can really blend into each other. The midpoint sets up the via negativa, leads us right into the nadir, or the ordeal. So the nadir, shifting over into the nadir is now that critical moment where we're going to have that final extinguishing, that final ego death. Not, well, that, okay, where we're going to have this ego death, this extinguishing, and then also discover this new insight. Ego death is confusing. And let me give you an example of how confusing it is. Neo, in this moment, for Neo, the crucial moment at the bottom is when we go, the exact moment when we go from Act 2 to Act 3, is the moment that he decides to sacrifice himself to save Morpheus. So they're about to unplug Morpheus, complete extinguish, right? So they're threatening to extinguish Morpheus. And in that moment, he says no, and he basically knows that he's dooming himself if he goes in. He says, no, I'll go in and save him, because he was told by the Oracle that you could save him, but it'll cost you your own life. So in that moment, he makes the decision. So that's the moment when he's willing to die. That's the moment where his ego is really sacrificed. Now, later, he's going to actually be shot and resurrect. That is not his ego death. When he's shot, I almost think that it's just, this happens a lot. Okay, so let me zoom out and show you something. So if death is here, this Western piece, death here, And resurrection is here, right? Well, not all stories actually have a character die and then be resurrected, and the whole journey take place between death and resurrection. So what instead happens is we still have resurrection here all the time, right? This is when, you know, Beauty wakes up, or Sleeping Beauty wakes up, or anyway, whatever, infinite resurrections. I'm sure you can think of them here. So what often happens is we have death just in time for resurrection. We have the death happen actually after they've near the return threshold. They die at the return threshold to be resurrected again. So really what we have with Neo is he leaves his old self behind and he goes into the other world. At the bottom, right before the eclipse of, or the new moon, or the darkness that will be the extinguishing of Morpheus, he says, no, don't do it. And that's his ego death. And then he'll come back and he'll die, be killed just in time to be resurrected. So I know that it gets confusing because, like, this is a place of resurrection, but this is where everybody always dies. You always see death right around here at the end, just in time for resurrection. That shouldn't be their ego death. Ego death, at least not from this paradigm, at the bottom. And that's, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Okay, so now let me go back. Which one were we using? That's what I was going to do. Oh, via negativa. That's what I was going to get into. Was Eliade. What Eliade says about the via negativa at this point, as we approach the end of the old year. The old year is almost extinguished. The Yule log has almost burned out. So you see how the extinguishing, the nirvana extinguishing, lines up with the extinguishing of the year as well. So for Eliade, the extinguishing of the year is what happens right before the renewal of the new year, right? And chaos is what happens in the middle. So leading into the end of the year, this is when there's scapegoating. This is when there's purging, any kind of purging of the old year, any kind of purging of what was. This is when there's fasting, emptying, confessions, expulsions of demons and diseases. So this is when we're trying to empty it all out again so that we can fill it back up. Deconstructing ego, developing inferior functions. Still in initiation mode. It's just a different part of the initiation. What else? Last vitality is waning. Oh, I love this part. This is when the Act 2, if you've got so you've crossed the threshold for the first, so when this is when the seed or the semen is going into the earth or the womb, just like Theseus going into the labyrinth. So now we're getting deep into the labyrinth. Now the seed is settling deep into the earth, starting to get really still. Any other ones? Let's see here. Oh, yeah, this is what he calls, after the midpoint, this is what he says, bad guys close in and all is lost. So this is, you know, now they're on the Death Star, bad guys are closing in on them, they're totally screwed, or, you know, they've just found out that Neo is not the one, and now they're being chased and the bad guys are closing in. So this is a way to show, you know, the deeper deconstruction further loss of control. All is lost. And then ultimately leading what he calls to the dark night of the soul. So now we're into this, into the nadir. So the dark night of the soul, we're going to transition from Act 2 to 3 is going to be transition from the dark night of the soul into, for him, break into 3. From the final going out of light to the first coming on of the first little bit of light. So in the dark night of the soul is a title, or it's a phrase that comes from St. John of the Cross that then gets adopted for story structure. But St. John of the Cross really, really wanted God to connect with him. And it was only after he finally was like, damn it, it's never going to happen. And he finally let it all go and felt total despair about being disconnected from the divine, that finally something came through and he felt the connection. So this is that experience, where it's only when things are at their absolute worst or darkest that something good can be figured out. Because what happens when they're at their worst or at their darkest? We give up. We let go. And when we go from resisting, this is the psychological insight here. This is the key piece. When you go from resisting, that's what the ego does. You're trying to control. That's what the ego does. Trying to win. That's what the ego does. Well, the only winning is to let go of the ego. So it's not by controlling. So it's only when we're so lost and we've basically given up. Giving up is often a giving up of the ego. Giving up often is a little ego death. And it's just so cool that it happens to line up so perfectly with how the moon actually works. It's when it's darkest that the light comes. It's when we're most lost that we're found. And this is the same with Percival, the Grail Knight. He has to become totally lost in the forest before he can find his way. So the insight, though, that they should come across, and now this might be a big ordeal, by the way. I'm talking about this conceptually, but what's really nice is if you make a big container. We haven't been talking about scenes or sequences or anything like that, but I think it's nice to try to make the ordeal in a big container. A big sequence, right? It all takes place in the Death Star, or it all takes place in this one trip into the Matrix between when they go in and come out this one time. That's the sequence from the midpoint to the end of Act 2 is when they go into the Matrix and they come out. It's a little container. So there's like a containing sequence. So this ordeal, this big containing sequence should be what was set up in the beginning. You're the one. We're going to take you to the Oracle. You're going to be the one. Inciting incident, call to adventure. You're the one. Call. We're going to go to the Oracle. Then the ordeal is the going to the Oracle sequence. The call is we're going to go get Leia. The ordeal is the getting Leia sequence. So if you can get this whole part of the story, this whole sequence. So the Buddha is going to become enlightenment. Call to enlightenment. What's the ordeal? Sitting down and meditating for 39 days. Because right after the midpoint, in the middle way, that's when he basically goes and sits. He's like, oh, I know I'm ready. And he goes and sits down. So the midpoint kicks off those 39 days, basically. So that's the contours conceptually. You're going to start to feel that waning, that self-deconstruction, maybe even a giving up. Bad guys are closing in. Everything's getting bad. But if you can put that in a big old container, a nice coherent sequence, people will get it in a more powerful way. We're making progress. Now, In the one of the inflections of this ordeal of the ego death, on one hand, it's your own ego that has to die. On the other hand, it's the tyrant that you have to confront. The ego is an inner experience of your protagonist and a projected outer experience of your world. So you've got your antagonist, and then you've got the ego in your protagonist. So in the case of Star Wars, this is when we're going to have the conflict with Darth Vader. In this case, actually, Star Wars isn't a good example because of the trilogy nature in this particular case. But this is when you roar the royal no, when the lion roars the royal no. So it's not just that the ego dies in yourself or you let go of the ego in yourself. The Buddha also confronts Mara, the illusion, the tyrant of illusion, the ego tyrant of illusion. And he says, fuck you, Mara. Stop putting me in an illusion. I'm done with your shit, basically. I'm not going to let you be the architect of my illusion anymore. So he has to confront the ego architect of his illusion, the tyrant, the thou shalt, and he has to let go of that ego in himself. It's two sides, it's two pieces. Overcoming the ego inside, confronting the thou shalt. And this is, if we go back to our separation, initiation, return, the culmination of the initiation phase. The final test. You guys are going to be stealing pebbles from my hand soon enough. You guys probably didn't watch enough of that Kung Fu. Do you guys remember Kung Fu? That was the yes. Your final initiation, the final test is to steal the pebble from your mentor out of their hands. You got to defeat your mentor. By the way, this is another thing that often happens at this part of the story. The loss of the mentor. This is when Obi-Wan Kenobi dies. This is when Morpheus is out of the picture. Now, why is that? Yeah, Milan.
I'm not sure why. But that just made me think of how, the mentor being defeated by the student, and like you just said, Obi-Wan Kenobi dying. That's kind of interesting because that shows a little bit of a journey for the mentor in a way, because it's like the mentor is willingly putting themselves through an ego death if they get defeated by their student, showing that like the person that you've trained can actually surpass you is a sort of an ego death. So then that's also like a little arc for the mentor. But
1000%. And it's maybe some of you have lived this one out. A lot of times the mentor will become that which is resisting the growth of the protege, because the mentor no longer has the vitality of the protege, and the mentor doesn't think the protege is ready because the protege is never organized and is never structured and is never on time. And so they're always trying to make the protege be more ordered, while the protege is like, stop holding me back. I've got this raw talent, right? Which you saw in Star Wars. But so what happens is, and this also is going on in Dragon Ball, as I learned from the dissertation I just read on Dragon Ball. I was on a dissertation committee on the myths of Dragon Ball. So what happens is that the mentor has two options. A healthy mentor recognizes, like a healthy parent, that they're no longer the center of the world, that they're now in service to the protege. They're now in service to the child. But maybe some of you have had or know some fathers who still want to be mommy's little star for their whole life. And that is our culture. Our culture makes it very hard for men to grow up and want to be dads when they only get affirmation for being mommy's little star. And so the mentor, if the mentor wants to be mommy's little star, if the mentor wants to stay the hero, wants to still be the show, then they will eventually become an obstruction to the hero. And this is where we have the false mentor model. Or sometimes it's a real mentor, but you've seen many stories where the mentor becomes the bad guy, is revealed as the bad guy. So the mentor, if they do not willingly get out of the way of the hero, if they then they will actually be the villain that has to be defeated in this sequence by the hero. If they willingly get out of the way and let their ego go and let the other guy become the hero, then we have the Obi-Wan situation. Yeah, Olivia.
Yeah, I mean, in response to like what you were kind of saying earlier, it's like this moment of either like the loss of the mentor or the mentor stepping back, or just as Milan said, the protege, surpassing the mentor. That's kind of the moment where you take off the training wheels. It's like, oh, I'm not capable of surviving in this, this new world. It's no longer new anymore. I've like assimilated. I mean, I think most of us probably felt this way in terms of like moving to LA of like, oh my gosh, this is so new. It's like, okay, I have my bearings and stuff, and to go on from there. As someone who's like experienced, until you said that, I was like, oh, I guess I have experiences in my own life, not even just with LA, but just, here at home within like my church choir sort of thing. That's kind of that moment of, it's like it no longer becomes the new world anymore. That becomes almost your norm. Like think of like an avatar.
Uh-huh.
Though like with Jake, it's like he adapts himself so much to the world of the Na'vi that becomes his world. That's the world he now fights to save. It's like a complete shift of, your comfort zone. So what's it called? The normal world is no longer the normal world. That is the new world in which you are now assimilating with this new world.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I mean, technically, I guess it is still the normal world and the new world. But I mean, the longer you're in it, if that's something that you choose to stay with, okay, like something in Peter Pan, okay, that's definitely okay. New world. Come back to the old world, but it seems like a lot of the times there's like a shift of what is really like what really is the norm of that world. I mean, granted, I know we're scheduled to have like 3 more Avatar movies come out or something, so I'm curious to see now. It's like, okay, now there is no starting in that quote quote like normal world. You're already
There
within
will
that
be a
world.
new normality, right? And
Exactly.
they will start the story in whatever the new normal is.
So it'd be weird to see kind of like if like a continuation of the cycle of, okay, normal world into new world becomes normal,
Yeah.
this past world, and then okay, then what's the new world from there once this becomes the normal? And how I think because you mentioned this earlier in a couple classes ago, but like how we're always like working towards our purest form. So I think that like that's like in the same way of developing new world, we're constantly, even like within our society, working closer to like ending like systemic racism within like within our society, or just homophobia and etc. Like we're slowly moving forward. Like how many times that happens just in our our fictional world. That was a long tangent, but
No, good.
yeah, that was kind of inspired off of what you were saying about protege surpassing, mentor stepping back, and it's like
what
the young
happens when
blood
the
that
mentor's out of the way?
get into what it like, I guess the potential that it has.
That you're going exactly the direction I want to go with this. Maybe Maddie wants to take it there.
I was just gonna add something else. I think I'm not sure if this is the direction that you were gonna go in, but I really like the concept of like the mentor not willing to give up being the main character kind of thing, like the mentor wanting to take the story into its own hands and not willing to like give the protege the power to become the special one. I really like that concept, like from a storytelling perspective. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and think about how like when Gandalf is like, no, don't give me the ring. You're the fucking hero, and one of the things with and by the way, the mentor also dies at the end of disappears at the Nadir in Lord of the Rings, right? They're in the bottom of the freaking belly of the underworld in Moria, and that's where he disappears. Well, why? Because the mentor is the captain. The mentor has a plan. The mentor knows what to do. Well, if the mentor has a plan and knows what to do, then it's not the hero who has to have the plan and has to know what to do. The reason the mentor's got to be gone at this point is because next the hero's got to be the one whose agency is on display. We've got to shift the leadership. Because up until now, the mentor is the leader. The hero is not the leader normally at this point, right? Like kind of maybe, depending on the story. But if there's a clear mentor, Gandalf's the guide. You know, Morpheus is the guide, right? Like, this is when we lose that mentorship and we lose the help. And now it's all on the character and their own, you know, authentic capacities. Oh, Garrett, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I was kind of going to talk a little bit about this, maybe pulling it back, but I was going to talk a little bit on the mentor and how like I'm interested in its use of like, because you brought up Dragon Ball, which I think brought an interesting point about how mentors in like movies, they're either going to die or end up becoming a villain a lot of the time, because once they've taught the hero everything they need to teach them, they've kind of outlived their usefulness from a story perspective. So they either need to die to give something to the hero to fight for, or become a villain so that the hero can show that true opposition and then like truly show that he's surpassed and is the best at whatever he's doing. But with Dragon Ball, because it's a little bit more of a procedural, you still see the mentor show, though he's not as powerful anymore, he still shows the fact that he is older and has knowledge. Because the mentors, there's a lot of mentors in Dragon Ball, and the characters who they're mentors to are constantly going back to them for, even though they're stronger now, they're constantly going back to them for knowledge about how to exactly tackle a problem. Because sometimes now, like with Goku, you see he's so powerful, he forgets how to be, like, what it's like to not be that powerful, and so he's constantly being brought back down by his mentor. Like, hey, remember what it's like when you can't like destroy a world with a flick of your thumb? And so I'm interested. I'm just thought that was a curious thought I would share. So
well, yeah, and I think that the mentor should learn how to take on that supporting role and basically become Merlin. And if they can, then you know Obi-Wan's actually the mentor for the rest of the story. He doesn't actually disappear. He keeps coming back and keeps mentoring. And so I think that that's a great thing. The mentor doesn't have to die. A lot of times the mentor or Gandalf comes back and mentors the rest of the story. It's just crucial that we get him out of there at that crucial time when we need to shift and just demonstrate the agency of the fellowship at that point. I wanted to come to Eliada. And for Eliada, the ordeal is the renewal event. The ordeal is the New Year's ceremony, or the coronation ceremony, or the election, or whatever the cycle is. This is that New Year's event. This is the renewal event. So your story might, you know, maybe your ordeal works backwards from a big coronation event as your ordeal. I think that might work for Garrett, or at least in one of his versions, in his macro narrative. But this might help you think about how to have a big ordeal. How can you have something that that's like culture wide? You know, like in the Matrix, we're only dealing with a set of characters. We're not paying attention to what the whole world is doing. But if you are paying attention to and you don't have to do it this way, but it's nice. This is one way to do it, where you can actually have the big cultural event, renewal event, New Year's event, coronation event, marriage, you know, whatever it is that's going to be that big renewal event. But what probably is it's probably supposed to be an event that renews the wasteland as it was. And now your character is going to subvert the event to create a renewal in the direction that you want. Don't have to do that, but it gives you some options. Maddie, you wanted to ask something? Are you looking close at the diagrams?
I just think that's an interesting concept. You said the main character can subvert the renewal into something that is more beneficial to them and their cause.
Exactly. So we think that we're going to do the election, and the election's just going to restore the same wasteland we've always been in, but instead something else happens.
Okay, wait, is this like in Mulan when they have that big festival at the ending and they think all is well, but then she is like using it to like fight the Huns? Does that make sense?
Probably, yeah. Now, sometimes the third act also will have some kind of big event that will be the background for the finale too. So I haven't seen that in a while, so I forgot. And that kind of background event for the finale of Act 3 that's not normally the same thing. That's not normally the like deep renewal event. It's normally something more like something coming out. It's more like a coming out event, like something about to open, an opening day, or yeah, Olivia.
Okay, I don't want to spoil the Hunger Games for anyone, so if you don't want to spoil or close your ears, I guess. But would this be like, so Katniss deciding to shoot? Wait, Helen, have you seen the Hunger Games?
Yeah, it's been a while.
Oh, so
But
would
yeah.
this be like Coin deciding to? I mean, Cat deciding to shoot Coin in the stomach instead of like having District 13 take over and then Snow dying anyway, et cetera. And that complete like upheaval of what they were thinking, the direction for the district was going in. Would that count? Kind of think it's like a different direction for the renewal.
I don't remember the sequence. You're probably right, but if it was an event that was supposed to be the event where the former world would have been renewed as the same problematic former world it always was.
Yeah, kind of. In which they wanted to do a like if they wanted to do like a new Hunger Games with like the capital's children and whatnot. District 13 was going to take over, and then Katniss saw through. She's like, oh no, she's like preaching all this, but she's really another tyrant in disguise. So the pivotal moment, she goes, instead of shooting Snow,
yeah,
boom, kills her instead, and they like bomb rush on Snow, and it's
perfect. Yeah, I like it. Yeah. So that might, so hopefully you guys are starting to get some feelings of your stories, and they're starting to get combed through and combed into position. And Act 3 is going to be more so about like delivering the solution to the world and showing a final finale of how does the character look when they've changed or whatever. But a lot of the work is in Act 2. Like like the setups can write themselves, and you kind of know what your ending needs to be. Act 2 is typically the hard part. So definitely also glad to meet with anybody again this Friday if anybody wants to set up a meeting.
And to be clear, we're meeting at 4:30 on Friday?
Next Friday, yeah.
Next Friday, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right.
Any other questions or check-ins with where we are? I know we're right up to the hour. Cool. Well, happy Earth Day tomorrow.
Happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Linn.
Cool. See y'all. Have a good day.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you tomorrow for our meeting.
Mhm.
Thank you.